Welcome to another glimpse from the study of the covenant. I'm Dr. Paul Peterson. In this particular quarter, the second quarter of 2021, our topic for our Sabbath School Bible studies is the covenant, an important theme throughout the whole Bible. The last two Sabbaths have laid a foundation. We looked at creation and the original relationship between God and humans. This relationship was broken by sin, and this new situation has made it necessary for God to intervene, to approach us, to seek out human beings in order to restore and re-establish the original relationship. This is the need for a covenant. God comes with a new agreement, a new deal. And that deal has three basic elements. He gives a promise of what he intends to do. He sets out the criteria, the way we are to behave in order to be part of that agreement. And then there is a confirmation, a ratification of the covenant by the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Now, last Sabbath we then studied like a potpourri of things to come, different texts that we will return to and enlarge in our discussion the next 11 Sabbaths. So, with this in mind, we have come to the study of the covenant with Noah. Now, here an advice for those of you who are leading out in the study. There are two pitfalls. Beware. You may study the whole story about Noah and forget the overall theme of the quarter, that is the covenant. Because there are so many interesting issues in the story about Noah and the flood that we may forget the overall theme. That would be unwise. The other pitfall is to forget to distinguish between this particular covenant and the covenant of salvation, because it is true that Noah was saved and that's part of the covenant, but throughout the Bible there are many different covenants, and we have to be able to distinguish between them. So this is a particular covenant, or actually several covenants with Noah, and there is at least one major reason that the author of the lesson chose this one as the first example of a covenant. That is, it is in chapter 6, verse 18 in Genesis, we find the first instance where the word for covenant is used. Now remember, words are important, but you also want to look at the concepts. So where you have words for covenant, of course covenant is a theme, but the theme of the covenant could be there even without the specific word. But this is the first time in verse 18 in chapter 6, God says to Noah, I will establish my covenant with you, and you will enter the ark, you and your sons and your family and the animals. So this is God speaking to Noah, giving him the promise, if you build the ark and enter it, you will be saved, because all other animals on earth will die. And it happens. Of course, this is salvation, but it is salvation in a very specific and concrete manner. He was saved from dying in the flood. But as the story goes on, and God begins to renew the relationship with human beings that are to live in the world after the flood, we will see that God established another covenant that is not in particular only with Noah and his family, but with all those who live after the flood until the second coming. So this is not like the covenant God establishes with Israel on Sinai, with the sanctuary that were to function until the sacrifice of Jesus. No, this is a covenant that describes the situation in which humans live from the time of Noah until the end of the world. In a sense, it begins already in verse 1 in chapter 8, because in chapter 8 and chapter 9, you have 7 instances of God speaking or acting. 7 verbs connected to God. Chapter 8, verse 1, God remembered. And then you have in verse 15, God said to Noah, come out of the ark. And then you have in verse 21, after Noah has made a sacrifice, the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma. Then in chapter 9, you have in verse 1, God blessed Noah and his sons, saying to them, be fruitful and increase in number, a reminder of what God spoke to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden in chapter 1:26. The Garden of Eden is first mentioned in chapter 2, but nevertheless. And then in the remainder of chapter 9, you have 3 other instances, 3 verbs connected with God. They are all the verb to speak or say. Verse 5, God said to Noah and to his sons with him, now I establish my covenant with you. Verse 12, this is a sign of my covenant. And then he refers to the rainbow. And summary or rounding off in verse 17, so God said to Noah, this is a sign of the covenant I have established between me and all life on earth. This is a Noachite covenant. Now, if you come from a Lutheran world, as I do, there is not much speaking about the covenants except for the Old and the New Covenant, while in the Calvinistic world you will find that the covenants occupy a lot of theological reflection. That's a difference in, let's say, church tradition or theological background. This Noachite covenant is the covenant between God and humankind from the time of Noah until the end of the world. That is how to live. And it is reiterating elements of creation, but in a new and less positive environment. Because of the change in environment, for instance, there is a new diet. Humans are allowed to eat flesh or meat. And because that means that we are allowed to kill them, which in itself is not a good thing. God underlines, but you're not allowed to kill a human being, that we have in verse 6. So there's a new diet. There is an appeal to multiply and fulfill the earth. There has been a reference to clean and unclean animals. Creation is an important theme here because this is in a less perfect environment, the New Deal for human beings. So far, the covenant with Noah. Now, if you happen to be the leader of the Sabbath School study, you will not avoid questions, and you may have more time to discuss questions that may not be directly related to the theme of the covenant. Because people read the story about the flood. I cannot answer all these questions, but here are at least a couple of answers to commonly raised questions. You see, if you read critical commentaries, encyclopedias, and so on, you will find that, first of all, of course, most people will not believe there ever was a flood. That's one thing. But you also find that critical scholars will assume that there behind the biblical narrative of the flood lie several sources which have been mixed, like when you have a set of cards and you play and you put them together in somewhat disorganized fashion. That means that sometimes you have translations or comments that assume several sources and therefore also assume contradictions that do not necessarily belong to the text. Let me take two examples. In chapter 6, verse 19 and 20, you have the following, and I read here from a New International Version, chapter 6. You are to bring into the ark 2 of all living creatures, male and female, to keep them alive with you. In some translations, you get the clear sense that there are 2 of each. But as you read on, you realize there are 7 of the clean animals and only 1 of the unclean. This is not a contradiction. The word that is used here in 6, 19 and 20 for pair, shenayim, is so-called dualis. It's 2, not singular, but with 2, and it simply means they came by pair. Now, how many came of each particular type of animals, that's then revealed a little later. Or you go to chapter 7, where you have 2 descriptions of how Noah and his family entered the ark. Chapter 7, verse 7, Noah and his son and his wife and so on entered the ark. Then you have a period of 7 days, and then in verse 13, on that very day, Noah and his sons and so on entered the ark. And people say, oh, these are 2 different stories. No, they are the verb in 2 different forms, and in the second, as indicated by the New American Bible and its translation, it is to be understood as a pluperfect. That is, on that very day, they had entered, and now the rain came. And for anyone who reads English, well, I have to recommend you the commentary on Genesis in the new and forthcoming Seventh-day Adventist commentary series, the commentary by Jacques Ducan on Genesis. It is a wonderful read, and many of these questions will be answered in this particular book. One last reference. Noah is not unknown to New Testament writers. Jesus mentions Noah in Matthew 24 when he speaks in verses 37 and 8 about the environment, the moral environment, or should we say immoral environment before the flood. Noah is among the heroes of faith in Hebrews, and Hebrews is interesting because it is a book about the covenants. And in chapter 11, you have the heroes of the covenant. And what is unique about them is that they act in faith. Faith is not separated from their actions. In faith, Noah built, is what is said. If he had not believed, he wouldn't have built the ark. The 2 last references I will mention is from 2 Peter 2:5, where Peter speaks about Noah, and then the wonderful, interesting comment about Noah and the flood in 1 Peter 3. This is a difficult and controversial text because it has spoken about spirits in prison, but if you read on from verse 21 without going into that controversy, you find a wonderful analogy between the flood and the covenant of baptism. This water symbolizes baptism, the baptism that now saves you. Not the removal of dirt from the body, but the pledge of a good conscience toward God. And even though the word covenant is not mentioned here, it is assumed by the concept of the covenant is assumed, because the covenant between God and man in baptism can be symbolized by the flood. God initiates the contact. He promises salvation. We respond in faith. We're baptized. We're buried. And then we are raised to a new life all by the grace of God. That is the covenant of His grace. Thank you for listening to this glimpse from the theme of the covenant.